The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stone floors of the scullery, creeping through the worn leather of her boots. It clung to the damp wool of her tunic and settled deep in her bones, a permanent ache that reminded her of what she was: an outcast, a ghost haunting the edges of the Blackwood pack. Alara wrung out a filthy rag, the icy water stealing what little warmth remained in her fingers. Her crime was in her blood. 3 centuries ago, her ancestor was accused of murdering the Alpha King's mate and pup, a betrayal so profound it had fractured their world. As punishment, every member of the Lyran line was branded, a swirling mark of a serpent eating its own tail seared into the flesh of their left wrist, a permanent declaration of their tainted nature. It meant she was less than Omega. She was nothing, permitted to live only to serve as a reminder of treachery. She ate last, slept least, and endured the scorn that was her birthright. Her world was the sting of lye soap, the burn of an empty stomach, and the heavy weight of a history she had no part in creating. A sudden commotion from the courtyard shattered the morning's grim routine. Shouts echoed, sharp and authoritative. Alara ignored it. Trouble was never for her, but it was always because of someone like her. She scrubbed harder at a stubborn stain, her knuckles raw and red. The scullery door crashed open. 2 royal guards, clad in the silver and black of the Alpha King himself, filled the doorway. Their presence was so alien in this place of grime and servitude that the air itself seemed to thin. Their eyes, cold as the mountain peaks, scanned the room and landed on her. On the sliver of branded skin peeking from her cuff. One of them stepped forward, his lip curled in disgust. Alara of the Lyran line? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. This was it. After 20 years of quiet suffering, her sentence had finally come. By order of the Alpha King Valerius, you are to be brought to the capital. The words were a death knell. The capital, the Frostfang Citadel, the seat of the king who had every reason to despise her existence. Fear, sharp and metallic, flooded her mouth. She didn't resist as they flanked her, their armored hands gripping her arms. There was no point. The serpent on her wrist had been biting down since the day she was born. Today, it would finally swallow her whole. The journey was a blur of cold wind and colder stares. They didn't bother to bind her. Where would she run? The entire northern expanse was his territory. Every wolf, every tree, every shadow answered to him. To flee was merely to choose the manner of her death. The Frostfang Citadel was not a castle. It was a mountain that had been conquered and weaponized. Towers of black granite clawed at the perpetually gray sky. It radiated a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, a deep, ancient chill of sorrow and power. Ilara was a speck of dust being drawn into the heart of a glacier. They dragged her not to a dungeon, but to the throne room itself. The chamber was vast, a cavern of polished obsidian and silver inlay that seemed to drink the light. Banners bearing the crest of a snarling silver wolf hung from the impossibly high ceiling. At the far end of the hall, upon a throne carved from a single block of ice-veined stone, sat the king. Alpha King Valerius was a figure from a nightmare. He was immense, broader and taller than any man she had ever seen. His hair was the color of winter frost, a stark contrast to the severe black of his furs. His face was all harsh lines and brutal beauty, a sculpture carved from granite and grief. But it was his eyes that held her, that pinned her in place. They were the color of a frozen lake, pale and devoid of any warmth. They held the weight of centuries, of a loss so profound it had become the bedrock of his entire being. The court, a collection of stony-faced alphas and disdainful nobles, lined the hall. Their collective hatred was a physical force, pressing in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Whispers slithered through the silence. The traitors get. Look at the brand. He will finally end the line. Her guards forced her to her knees on the icy floor. The impact sent a jolt of pain up her spine. She kept her eyes down, her world shrinking to the polished black stone beneath her cheek. This was the end of the story. Her story. A footnote in a tale of betrayal. Silence descended. A heavy, waiting silence that stretched for an eternity. She could feel his gaze on her, dissecting her, judging the blood in her veins. She braced for the command, for the blade, for the final merciful darkness. Then, something shifted. A presence coalesced beside the throne, something that was not quite there a moment before. Alara risked a glance upward. A wolf stood beside the king. It was a creature of myth, larger than any true wolf, its fur the color of moonlight on snow. It was not a physical being but a spirit, its form shimmering at the edges like heat haze. The king's wolf, the manifestation of his alpha spirit. The spectral wolf padded silently down the steps of the dais. It moved with a liquid grace that belied its size, its paws making no sound on the stone. The court held its breath. The king's wolf had not been seen outside of battle in generations. It ignored the nobles, the guards, its pale, glowing eyes fixed solely on her. It stopped a few feet away, its massive head level with hers. It radiated an aura of immense power and an ancient, aching sadness that mirrored its master's. She could smell the scent of pine and cold stone, of a winter that never ended. She did not feel fear, not from this creature. She felt seen. The wolf opened its mouth, and something dropped to the floor with a soft, metallic clink. It was a pendant. An old, tarnished silver locket shaped like a winter rose. It was caked in something dark and dry. Blood. The wolf nudged it with its nose, pushing it across the floor until it rested beside her trembling hand. A collective gasp went through the hall. Ilara recognized the design from the old tapestries. It was the personal sigil of the murdered Luna. King Valerius rose from his throne. The movement was slow, deliberate, yet it commanded the absolute attention of every soul in the room. He descended the steps, his gaze never leaving her, his expression unreadable. He stopped before her, looming like a storm cloud. He did not look at the locket, he looked at her, at the brand on her wrist. His wolf had brought this evidence, this relic of his greatest pain, and laid it at the feet of a branded traitor. Why? The question hung in the air, thick and suffocating. His voice, when it came, was deeper than she could have imagined, like the grinding of glaciers. It was quiet, yet it filled the entire cavernous hall. Leave us. The command was absolute. There was no hesitation. The nobles, the guards, the whispers, and the hate. They all receded, melting away until it was just the three of them in the echoing silence. The king, the branded, and the ghost wolf. He crouched before her, a mountain folding itself to her level. The cold radiating from him was intense, a physical manifestation of his power and his pain. His ice-blue eyes searched hers, looking for something she couldn't name. The traitor's mark? A flicker of guilt? "My wolf has never erred," he stated, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. "It smells the truth on a soul. It has brought a relic of my murdered wife and laid it at your feet. Not as an accusation." He paused, and for the first time a flicker of something other than cold entered his eyes. Confusion. As an offering. Ilara could not speak. The world had tilted on its axis. The evidence of the crime her family was condemned for was being presented to her as a gift. "You are a puzzle," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "And I despise puzzles." He rose to his full, intimidating height. "You will be housed in the North Tower, You will not leave. You will speak to no one but me." It was a prison sentence, but as guards returned to pull her to her feet, leading her not to a dungeon, but toward the royal wing, she realized it was the first time in her life she had not been condemned by the brand on her wrist. She had been chosen because of it. And that was a more terrifying prospect than any executioner's axe. The North Tower was a cage, but it was a gilded one. The room was larger than the entire hovel she had shared with 3 other outcasts. A fire crackled in the hearth, a roaring, defiant beast against the relentless cold of the citadel. There was a bed with furs so thick she sank into them, and a window that looked out over the snow-dusted peaks of the northern range. It was a luxurious prison. For the first 2 days, she was left entirely alone. Food appeared outside her door on silent feet. She ate until her stomach ached, slept until the nightmares of the throne room faded to a dull throb. She was warm, she was fed. She was waiting for the other boot to drop. On the 3rd night, he came. There was no knock, only the soft click of the heavy oak door opening. King Valerius stood there, a shadow against the torchlight of the hall. He was dressed not in the formal furs of the court, but in a simple black tunic and trousers. Without the trappings of his station, he seemed less like a king and more like a predator. He said nothing, simply moved to the fire and stared into the flames. His presence filled the room, charging the air with a tension that made her skin prickle. She remained by the window, a small frozen thing in the orbit of a dying star. "The locket," he said finally, his back still to her. "The blood on it was not my mate's. It was old, faded, but the scent, it matched a member of my council." Alara's breath caught. "Lord Kale," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "His great-grandfather, to be precise. He was the one who presented the evidence against your ancestor." He turned then, and his gaze was piercing. A convenient accusation, it would seem. She didn't know what to say. The foundation of her entire life, the bedrock of her shame, was cracking. "Then, my family is likely innocent," he finished for her. He said the words as if they were poison on his tongue. To admit her family's innocence was to admit his own failure, his own blindness for 300 years. It was to admit that the justice he had meted out was a lie. "Why tell me this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Because my wolf trusts you," he said, stepping closer. "And my wolf is all I have left of my instinct. My own judgment was clouded by grief long ago." He stopped a few feet from her. The sheer size of him was overwhelming. "I need to know why. Why you? A slip of a girl with a traitor's brand. What is it about you that my spirit recognizes?" He was not asking a question. He was issuing a challenge. He was a man lost in a fog of his own making, and he believed she was a lighthouse, though he knew not why. "I am no one," she said, the words a familiar, painful refrain, a scullery maid, the last of a cursed line. "No," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "You are something more. I can feel it, a flicker of warmth in this frozen wasteland of a castle. I will discover what it is." This became their ritual. Every night he would come to her chambers. There were no pleasantries, no small talk. He would simply enter and watch her, asking questions that were more like dissections. He asked about her childhood, about the brand, about the whispers and the scorn. He listened with an unnerving stillness, his pale eyes tracking her every movement, every flicker of emotion. She, in turn, began to see past the terrifying mask of the Alpha King. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes. She saw the way his hand would sometimes clench, as if holding back an agony that was always just beneath the surface. The castle was not just cold stone, it was a mausoleum, and he was its chief mourner. He was haunted, and his ghosts had long since become his only companions. One night he found her huddled by the window, staring out at the snow. She hadn't touched her dinner. A wave of despair had washed over her, the familiar feeling of worthlessness that had been her shadow for so long. Even in this gilded cage, she was still the branded girl. He stood behind her for a long moment. She expected a sharp word, an order to answer his questions. Instead, she felt something brush against her shoulders. He had taken one of the heavy furs from the bed and draped it around her. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, it shattered her composure. A tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cold cheek. He didn't move away. He stood there, a silent mountain at her back, his presence a strange and confusing comfort. "You are cold," he stated simply, as if it were the only reason for his action. "I'm always cold," she whispered, unable to stop the words. He was silent for another long moment. Then, his voice, softer than she had ever heard it, reached her. "Not when I am here." It wasn't a promise, it was an observation. And it was true. The intense, almost unnatural cold that clung to him seemed to recede when he was near her, replaced by a strange, humming energy that warmed her from the inside out. He had set a boundary from the beginning. "This is not kindness," he had told her once. "You are an anomaly, a loose thread in a tapestry I thought complete. I am merely pulling on it to see what unravels." But the boundary was fraying. The interrogations became conversations. He spoke of his kingdom, of the weight of his crown, of the emptiness of the halls. He never spoke of his lost family, but their ghosts were in every word he left unsaid. She, in turn, started to speak of more than just her suffering. She told him of the small kindnesses she had witnessed, even in the darkest corners of the pack. Of the Omega who would sneak her scraps of bread. Of the old wolf who taught her which herbs could soothe a fever. She showed him the person who had survived beneath the brand, the flicker of spirit that had refused to be extinguished. He was beginning to see her, and she was beginning to see the man drowning inside the king. The court did not see what was happening in the North Tower. They saw only that the branded girl had not been executed. They saw their king, who had not shown interest in another soul for 300 years, spending his nights closeted with the descendant of his greatest enemy. Whispers turned to rumors that she was a witch, that she had enchanted him with dark magic, that the traitor's blood was finally finishing its work, poisoning the king's mind. The architect of these rumors was Lord Kale. Kale was a handsome, silver-tongued wolf, a fixture at Valerius's side for decades. He was the picture of loyalty, his counsel always measured, his demeanor always respectful. But beneath the surface, a serpent coiled. His family had risen to power on the ashes of Ilara's. Her presence in the castle, her proximity to the king, was a threat to the lie that had sustained his house for centuries. He began his campaign subtly, a misplaced word of concern about the king's fatigue, a suggestion that the girl's influence was making him erratic. He preyed on the court's fear and superstition, fanning the flames of their hatred for Ilara. His first overt move came during a formal dinner. Ilara was not in attendance. She was still confined to her tower, but the event was in her name. Valerius had decreed a re-examination of the Lyran betrayal. The announcement was met with stunned silence, then a low murmur of dissent. Kale rose, his expression one of profound, pained loyalty. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice ringing with false sincerity, "we all grieve your loss. It is a wound our kingdom has borne for centuries. But to reopen it, to entertain the notion that this girl, this serpent, is anything but what her brand proclaims her to be, is to invite chaos. She is poisoning you with false hope." Valerius's eyes turned to chips of ice. "I was addressing my future queen," he said, the words dropping into the hall like stones. "Anyone who objects can take their concerns to my dungeons." The declaration was a thunderclap. Future queen. The words echoed in the stunned silence. He had not only declared his intention to exonerate her, but to elevate her. Kale's face was a mask of fury for a split second before he composed it back into a look of wounded concern. He had underestimated the king's attachment. He would have to accelerate his plans. His next move was more direct. He arranged for an ancient relic of the former Luna, a delicate music box she was said to have cherished, to be placed in the hallway outside Alara's tower. Then he used a sliver of magic, a simple shattering cantrip, to break it. The crash brought the guards running. They found Alara, who had heard the noise and opened her door, kneeling by the splintered remains of the box, her hands hovering over the wreckage as if to fix it. It was the perfect tableau. The witch, caught in the act of destroying the sainted Luna's memory. Kale arrived moments later, his face a mask of righteous fury. "Sacrilege!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at her. "She defiles the memory of our murdered Luna. How much more proof do you need, my king?" Valerius was summoned. He stood over the scene, his face unreadable granite. He looked at the shattered box, at Kale's triumphant sneer, and then at Ilara's horrified, pleading face. For the first time, doubt clouded his eyes. The weight of 300 years of belief was a heavy thing to cast aside. "She will be confined to the high tower," he commanded, his voice strained, "under full guard, until I get to the bottom of this." The words were a physical blow. He didn't believe her. After all their nights, all their conversations, when the moment of truth came, he had chosen the lie. The guards dragged her away. She looked back once, at his face. The confusion, the pain, the flicker of doubt. It was all there. But it wasn't enough. He hadn't chosen her. And in that moment, the hope that had so tentatively begun to bloom in her chest withered and died. The high tower was a true prison. The window was a narrow slit, barred and high. The door was solid iron. The warmth and comfort of her previous confinement were gone, replaced by the biting cold of stone and despair. She was alone again, truly alone. The brief, impossible dream of being seen, of being wanted, had been just that, a dream. Valerius had retreated into himself. Kale's theatrical display had shaken him, dredging up the ghosts he had only just begun to quiet. He was torn between the instinct of his wolf, which still growled in protest whenever Alara's guilt was mentioned, and the crushing weight of his own history. His grief was a weapon, and Kale knew precisely how to wield it against him. Valerius locked himself in his study, poring over the ancient records of the Lyran trial. He was searching for a crack, a flaw in the story that had defined his life, but the evidence, all presented by Kale's ancestor, was seamless, perfect, too perfect. Kale knew the king's resolve was faltering. He could not allow Valerius the time to find the truth. The king had to be removed, not killed. A dead king would inspire loyalty and investigation. No, he had to be neutralized. He had spent years searching for the right tool. He found it in a forbidden text, a poison known as hard ice. It was a rare, insidious substance derived from a parasitic lichen that grew only on the frozen graves of betrayed alphas. It did not attack the body. It attacked the spirit. It found the coldest part of a person's soul, a grief, a loss, and amplified it, freezing them from the inside out until their heart simply stopped. For a king like Valerius, whose soul was already a landscape of ice, it would be devastating. And it would look, to all the world, as if he had finally, tragically, succumbed to his own broken heart. That night, Kale laced a decanter of wine in the king's private chambers. He watched from the shadows as Valerius, exhausted and tormented by his indecision, drank it down. In her tower, Alara felt it. A sudden, violent wrench in her soul. It was a connection she hadn't known existed, a thin, silvery thread that had been weaving itself between her and the king during their nightly talks. Now, that thread was screaming, pulled taut with an agony that was not her own. A cold that had nothing to do with the stone around her seeped into her bones. It was his cold, his pain, his life, fading. Valerius, she whispered, the name tasting of ash and terror. In the royal chambers, the king collapsed. He clawed at his chest, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. It felt as if the glacier that had entombed his heart for 3 centuries was finally crushing him. A frost, delicate and deadly, began to creep across his skin, tracing the veins in his hands with patterns of white. His breath plumed in the air, though the room was warm. He was freezing to death in front of a roaring fire. The guards found him moments later. Panic erupted in the citadel. The healers were summoned, but they were helpless. They could find no wound, no poison in his blood. His body was simply shutting down, becoming a statue of ice and memory. Cale swept into the room, his face a perfect mask of horror and grief. "The branded witch has done this," he bellowed. "Her final curse. The king is dead." But he wasn't dead. Not yet. His heart was still beating, a slow, thready rhythm, a final, stubborn defiance. In the tower, the agony transmitted through the bond was unbearable. It was the feeling of being frozen alive, of hope turning to ice, of utter, complete despair. It was his pain, and it was hers. She knew, with a certainty that transcended all logic, that Cale was behind this. And she knew that if Valerius died, she would not be far behind. She threw herself against the iron door. It didn't budge. Panic gave way to a cold, hard rage. He would not die. She would not let this be the end. She would not let the lie win. She pressed her hands flat against the cold iron of the door. She closed her eyes, focusing on the screaming thread that connected her to him. She poured all of her will, all of her desperation, down that line. "Valerius," she breathed, a prayer and a command. A warmth bloomed in her chest. It was a feeling she had never known, a deep, primal heat that had been dormant her entire life. It surged down her arms into her palms. The iron door groaned, not from the heat, but from the force. A faint light, the color of dawn, seeped from beneath her hands. The lock, thick as her wrist, gave a sharp crack and shattered. She didn't question it. She ran. Down the spiraling stairs, past shocked guards who were too stunned by her appearance to stop her. She followed the thread, the tether of his pain, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone. She burst into the king's chambers. The room was crowded with panicked healers, grieving council members, and Cale, who was already directing affairs as if he were king. And on the bed, Valerius lay, his skin now a pale marble blue, his lips tinged with frost. He was barely breathing. "Get away from him, witch!" Kyle snarled, moving to block her. "It was you," she said, her voice low and shaking with a fury she didn't know she possessed. She shoved past him with a strength she shouldn't have had, a strength that sent the larger man stumbling back. She reached the bed. The cold coming off Valerius's body was terrifying, a palpable aura of death. She could feel his life, a tiny flickering ember about to be extinguished. She placed her hands on his frozen chest. The contact was so cold it burned. She closed her eyes and reached for the warmth inside her. She thought of his unexpected kindness, the fur he had draped over her shoulders. She thought of the loneliness in his eyes, a mirror of her own. She thought of the man, not the king. "You will not leave me too," she whispered, the words raw with grief and defiance. She poured everything she was into him, her pain, her hope, her stubborn refusal to be broken. The warmth inside her erupted. It was not fire. It was life. A blinding golden light exploded from her hands, engulfing the king's body. It was the light of a sunrise after a long winter, the heat of the first spring thaw. The frost on his skin vanished, melting away like a bad dream. The blue tint of his lips faded, replaced by color. The ice that had been encasing his heart didn't just melt, it shattered. And as the light poured into him, it did more than purge the poison. It carried with it the truth. Images, feelings, memories flooded his mind. Kale, a century ago, meeting with a shadowy figure. The scent of Kale's great-grandfather on the locket. The glint of triumph in Kale's eyes as he shattered the music box. The truth of the last 300 years, unspooling in a single, searing moment of clarity. Valerius's eyes snapped open. They were no longer the pale, frozen blue of a winter lake. They were the vibrant, clear blue of a summer sky. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first true breath he had taken in centuries. The light from Alara's hands faded, leaving her trembling and drained. She collapsed forward, her strength gone. Before she could fall, a strong arm wrapped around her, pulling her onto the bed, against a chest that was no longer cold, but warm and vibrantly alive. Valerius sat up, holding her. He looked over her head at the stunned faces in the room, his gaze finally landing on Lord Kale, whose face had gone white with terror. "Treason!" The king's voice boomed, filled with a power and clarity no one had heard in living memory. "And murder." The spectral wolf materialized beside the bed, no longer shimmering and sad, but solid and radiating pure alpha fury. It let out a guttural growl that shook the very stones of the castle, its glowing eyes fixed on the traitor. Kale tried to run. He didn't get 2 steps before the guards, their faces a mixture of awe and renewed loyalty, seized him. He was dragged from the room, his terrified protest swallowed by the stone. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. The healers and council members were staring, their minds unable to process what they had just witnessed. A witch had not cursed their king. She had saved him. The branded girl was a source of life, not death. Valerius ignored them all. His attention was solely on the woman in his arms. She was shaking, her energy completely spent. He gently pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "You healed me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him. It was awe. It was gratitude. It was a love so profound it was terrifying. "I wouldn't let you go," she whispered, her head resting against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. The ice was gone. All of it. In its place was a warmth that made her soul ache. "I was wrong," he said, the admission costing him nothing now. "For 300 years I have been wrong. Your family, they were victims, not traitors." He looked down at her left wrist, which lay against his chest. He covered it with his large hand. A soft, warm light glowed beneath his palm. When he pulled his hand away, the brand was gone. The ugly, swirling serpent had vanished, as if the skin had been reborn. In its place, shimmering faintly under her skin, was the mark of a silver wolf. The mark of the Alpha's mate, his Luna. "You were never the poison," he murmured, his voice breaking. "You were always the cure." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was the meeting of 2 broken souls who had, against all odds, found their missing piece. In that single moment, the ghosts that had haunted the Frostfang Citadel for 3 centuries finally found their peace and faded away. The kingdom changed. It was a slow thing at first, like the turning of a season. With Kale's treachery exposed and his conspirators rooted out, a poison was cleansed from the court. But the real change came from the throne itself. Valerius was no longer the ghost king. The grief had not vanished. It was a part of his history, a scar he would always carry, but it no longer defined him. The ice had receded, revealing the king he was meant to be: strong, decisive, and filled with a fierce, protective love for his people and, above all, for his queen. Alara, his Alara, was the source of that change. She was not the queen they had expected. She was not a noblewoman, skilled in politics and courtly intrigue. She was quiet, her power not one of command, but of compassion. She walked the halls of the citadel not as a ruler, but as a healer. Where she went, warmth followed. The cold, sterile stone seemed to soften in her presence. Laughter, a sound unheard in the castle for generations, began to echo in the corridors. Her formal coronation was a simple affair. Valerius stood before the assembled packs of the north, his hand holding hers. He did not speak of laws or treaties. He simply told them the truth. He told them of his own blindness, of the centuries-long injustice done to the Lyran line, and of the woman who had saved his life and his soul. "She is the heart of this kingdom," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute conviction, "and she is my heart." There were no objections. They had all seen the change in him, felt the change in the land. The winters seemed less harsh, the springs more vibrant. They saw the silver wolf mark that now graced her wrist, a mark of the goddess herself, and they accepted. They hailed Queen Alara, their healer, their hope. Months passed, melting into a year. The North Tower, once her gilded cage, became their sanctuary. It was where they could shed the weight of their crowns and simply be Valerius and Alara. He would sit for hours, watching her tend to the herbs she now grew in a small garden she'd cultivated on the balcony, the scent of life and earth filling the once sterile room. She learned the man behind the crown. She discovered his dry, unused wit. She saw the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he truly smiled, a rare and precious sight. He, in turn, learned the depths of her resilience, the fierce strength that lay beneath her gentle exterior. She had survived the worst the world could throw at her, and had not become bitter. She had held on to her kindness like a shield. One evening they stood on that same balcony, looking out at the vast, snow-capped wilderness that was their home. A gentle snow was falling, each flake a perfect crystalline star. She was bundled in a heavy fur cloak, but the only warmth she needed was from his arm, wrapped securely around her. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The silence? The solitude?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow. "I thought I preferred it," he answered, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I thought it was peace. I was a fool. It was not peace. It was an absence. The absence of you." He gently took her left hand, turning it over in his. He traced the spot where the serpent brand had been, the skin now smooth and unblemished, save for the faint silvery shimmer of the luna's mark. He lowered his head and pressed his lips to that spot, a gesture of profound apology and endless gratitude. "I spent 300 years honoring the dead," he murmured against her skin. "You taught me how to live for the living." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. The cold had not been her enemy. It had simply been awaiting. A long, deep winter, waiting for the one soul warm enough to bring the thaw. Here, in the heart of the North, wrapped in the arms of the man she had saved, the branded girl was finally, irrevocably, home. The past was a story of ghosts, but their future was a kingdom of light.